welcome to Game.Set.Deal, a space where we talk about sports and geopolitics. We're with the host, Francois Lorenzo, and our guest for today, Andrés Martinez. Andrés is a professor at the Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University, where he's also a special advisor to the president. In addition, he's the editorial director of Future Tense and an expert on the USA-Mexico relationship. Hello and welcome. First of all, do you prefer Andrés or Andrés?
Either is fine. Andrés is what I'm accustomed to when I'm in Mexico, and then in the US I get Andres or Andre or all sorts of variations. Oh. It's great to be with you guys. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. So Francois, what are we going to talk about today?
All right, so today it hasn't been the recently hot topic in geopolitics of sports. Obviously, we heard a lot about Russia recently. We're gonna hear a lot in the next coming month about Qatar with the World Cup coming up, but soon enough, because it's only 4 years from now, and I remember 4 years ago when France was world champion, and God knows that it went by really fast this past 4 years. So in 4 years from now, we'll be all watching, I guess, or for the ones who want to watch, I'll be watching for sure the World Cup in USA, Mexico, and Canada. So it's actually interesting. It's the second time in history that countries are going to co-host after Korea and Japan co-hosted in 2002. The USA has already hosted a World Cup in '94, Mexico too in '70 and '86, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. So those countries have the capacity of doing it individually, which was probably not the case with Japan and Korea. So it's really a conscious choice of these three countries to come together. So today's topic, we're going to look at the relationship between the US and Mexico and how sports plays a role in that relationship in light of that co-hosting of the World Cup. So first, just to set the basis, I guess, of the topic, Andres, could you tell us a bit about the relationship that these two countries have, just the basics, so we can understand it sort of like economically a little bit, culturally, like what kind of brings them together, what separates them, sort of just to give a brief overview and ground so we can get rolling.
So I should say that this is a relationship that I feel and live very personally, having grown up in Mexico and now living in the US. My mother was American, father was Mexican. So I consider myself a very binational citizen. And, you know, this is not to say that I'm anything special, because the first thing we should say is this is the reality for tens of millions of people. Like, our two countries, the US and Mexico, are so close. We live in a very symbiotic relationship, much like many of your European countries do. But oftentimes this is not fully appreciated in our context. Maybe it's because of the scale of each of the countries and some of the seeming dissimilarities. So from the outside, sometimes people can be surprised at just how intertwined Mexico and the US really are. I mean, a salient historical fact, which is, you know, kind of well known, but kind of often forgotten, is that half of what used to be Mexico is now in the US, right? So California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, you know, before we had a lot of talk about how many millions of people are crossing the borders, like the borders crossed a lot of people, right? So I'm sitting in Arizona, in the Phoenix area, and where I teach at Arizona State University. This is one of many states in the US that have this kind of mesh of the two cultures just baked into who we are. The names of cities, when you go through California and Texas and Arizona, they're in Spanish. You know, there's just so much connection culturally and even economically, right? So, you know, the U.S. is the top two trading partners for the U.S. are Canada and Mexico, and you know, China is often the third. And in terms of the exports from the U.S. often, you know, in the last couple of years, Mexico's been the number one, and then it's Canada, and we kind of take turns. So it's a huge relationship. There are, you know, so many Latinos in the United States who trace their heritage back to Mexico. And then you can get into breaking down people who have been here for generations versus more recent immigrants. Mexico is also the country in the world where that has the largest expat American population. So people often don't think of that in terms of the relationship. So I could go on and on, but clearly it's a relationship that is extremely important and kind of covers so many different subjects, whether we're talking about trade, the security situation for the US, and also manufacturing and our supply chains being so integrated across the border. We have a free trade agreement like you do in Europe for North America that includes Canada. And it's interesting when you go to Washington, you talk to people in government, they say this is a relationship like no other. Every single federal department of the US government has a representation in the US Embassy in Mexico City, which is not the case in any other country. Because again, this relationship is almost a foreign policy matter, but also a domestic one, right? Because there's the border, and there's the need to kind of regulate the use of the same water supplies that trickle down from Colorado into Mexico. So there are all sorts of issues that, when it comes to this relationship, can't be handled in the traditional way that a Secretary of State does, which is why the Vice President of the United States in recent times has typically been the point person for this relationship, because it encompasses both traditional international relations, but a lot of domestic subjects like environmental questions, domestic security, and so on and so forth. So that's an interesting illustration of what's unique about this relationship.
Okay, so it's if I understood well, it's like in between international and almost domestic relationship that they have.
Right.
And so
almost like the internal affairs within the European Union, right? It's like it's become more and more domestic as these societies become more integrated with each other. Yeah.
So talking on that, it's super interesting, obviously. The thing that first comes to mind when you talk about how intertwined these two are, and it's almost like the European Union. And when I think European Union, I'm thinking free flow of labor. And it's like 1 people out of 10 in the US is actually of Mexican descent. And when Trump, and you having lived in Mexico and the US and Mexican mother, and you actually are the perfect person to kind of give a perspective on that. Like, what is the weight that the Mexican descent population have in American like politics and society? Why was Trump trying to build a wall? Like, what is all that about?
Yeah, it's a good and a complicated question, because we do, we have seen in the US, as we've seen in a lot of other places, politicians and others trying to use the issue of immigration as a polarizing issue, in part to mobilize people and prey on their kind of vulnerability and uncertainty. We've seen dramatic changes in a lot of our countries, often driven by technology and globalization, and people who feel unease and anxiety at the speed with which things are changing. And this is obviously a very timely subject to bring up in the context of French politics too, right? But we've seen this in the US too, and elsewhere with, in the Brexit debates in the UK, kind of a pushback against globalization and a lot of the change in society and how it affects some segments of the population, and politicians who opportunistically say, I'm going to tell you who's at fault for, whatever anxiety you have. And guess what? It's that outsider, right? I mean, this is kind of a timeless thing in politics, right? Some of the, shifts that result in some people being left behind might be automation and technology, but it's easier for the politician to blame China or the Mexican immigrant than like your iPhone, right? Because we all love technology. So but it's contradictory in a way, because when you talk to economists who study this closely and experts, most people say that immigration has been one of the great competitive advantages that the US economy has benefited from, right? And yet politically, the discourse can often be very different. And people who are pro more immigration have been sort of on the defense now for more than a decade. So it was pretty startling to me, given my background, to see a political candidate for president make Mexico and Mexican immigrants kind of like put them at the center of his campaign for the presidency in 2016 and then succeed. Because I think one of my frustrations often is that people in the United States, they kind of take Mexico for granted. Like Mexico isn't a big problem. The United States is this massive continental power that is the only continental power in the world that doesn't have to devote the majority of its military to protect its borders, right? Like the United States is blessed to have Canada and Mexico as neighbors. When France was a big continental power in Europe, I mean, it still is, but historically, when it had antagonistic relations with its neighbors, the French army had to be deployed to protect its border with Germany, right? And the only country that's had this benefit of not having to have large militaries protecting their borders in order to be able to project power elsewhere in the world was historically England and the United Kingdom and the British Isles, because they were an island. The US has had kind of a similar benefit almost to being an island because it's had this very peaceful neighborhood, even though half of Mexico changed hands in the 19th century. We don't have the US military guarding our borders. We have like the border patrol, we have, so, if you're in the US military, your borders have never been really a big issue, which is kind of interesting. So so historically, my frustration is that people take Mexico for granted because again, it's not a big problem. When you go to Washington and you talk to, foreign policy elites, and even when I was in media, I worked at newspapers, everybody knew all about the Middle East and, Asia and other, these flashpoints of US, security and foreign policy. And Mexico was like, there was a complacency that it's there, it's not a problem. And suddenly Donald Trump is like, no, actually, like these people are crashing across our border and they're taking your jobs and they're a threat. And it's like, no. So it's really sad, and it leads to a lot of discrimination. And I think a lot of even people in the Republican Party who are more on the corporate side understand that the relationship with Mexico is hugely positive, and they're pro-immigration. But in terms of how this plays out in politics, often the loudest voice in the room prevails. And I think when you look at polls, most Americans are quite empathetic and sympathetic and appreciative of the role of immigrants in American society. But what you end up having is a very vocal minority for whom this is like the most important subject. And Trump was able to mobilize that sentiment. And there's kind of like a more relaxed majority who thinks this is nonsense, but they're not going to necessarily mobilize with the same passion around the immigration subject. Now, what you have seen is, as a result of this, you do see mobilization on the part of the Latino vote, as you alluded to. And, like Arizona, the state I'm sitting in, was a pretty strong Republican state for many election cycles, but partly in reaction to a lot of what we were listening to. Arizona voted for Joe Biden. So some of this anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican rhetoric can backfire because of the, going back to your question, the growing weight of the changing demographics in a lot of these states where you do have increase in Mexican American voters, both registering and then making their voices heard.
So I'd like to get to the core of today's talk. So we talked about the World Cup in the beginning, but what does this role that sports in general play in this relationship? Apart from the World Cup, we could talk about the NBA, the NFL, what they do in Mexico, but also like we could think about the MLS, the two teams in Los Angeles. Their stars are both Mexican players. We have Vela at the LAFC and Chicharito at the Galaxy. So could you tell us a little bit more about the sports, the role that sports have played in this relationship?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics because I do think that sports are hugely important in bringing people together and also serving, the soft power element of, people understanding a different society through sport. And I think, historically, I would say the U.S. sports being followed so closely in Mexico has had a huge impact on the relationship. Um, when I was a little kid, I'm old enough that things have changed quite a bit. I can remember the 1970s growing up in Mexico. There was still a very strong anti-American sentiment in Mexican politics. And in Mexico, because of some of the history, Mexican politicians, just like Trump now can use Mexico as a scapegoat. Boy, back then it was very common for Mexican nationalist politicians to be able to use the El Imperio, the empire to the north, as the excuse to explain anything that was not going right, right? Like, what do you expect? There was this great Mexican expression that maybe you have heard. It goes back to a 19th century leader, but he said, "Poor Mexico, so close to the United States, so far from God," right? And so there was this anti-American sentiment, and I think sports really has softened that tremendously. That anti-American discourse in Mexican politics has really, for the most part, gone away. Even though now we see a leader who wants to be more nationalist, he's not talking about the United States the way his predecessors would have. And even with the Donald Trump thing, like, most people in Mexico have very favorable views of the United States. And what I often tell, friends, and I talked to a group of former ambassadors from both countries on the use of on sport influence in the relationship. And I said, one of the reasons why the Mexican public no longer is going to accept this kind of crazy anti-American rhetoric, I mean, crazy, like if it's devoid from any reality, it's because you've had generations now of people who grew up watching the NBA, watching the NFL is hugely popular in Mexico. Um, Baseball, rooting for Mexican pitchers playing for the Los Angeles Dodgers, or, when I was a kid in Mexico, it was the early days of the NFL being so popular. I mean, Mexicans learned all about American geography because they knew that, these teams were in the Northern Conference. And, if you were a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, you knew they played Cincinnati and Cleveland, and you were tapped into this other society through sport. And so it was then going to be very difficult to accept some kind of caricature view, portrayal of this country or this society in a political context, because you're like, no, I'm rooting for the Steelers, or I'm rooting for the LA Dodgers. And this is very similar to the way in which now kids over here learn about Europe and European geography. Maybe they're watching the Champions League and they're following teams, and it kind of helps situate them in the world. So and the thing that's really changed and that's been interesting is that soccer, so football, depending on where we're talking about, but international football, the real football, soccer, that was not really part of this relationship up until very recently, right? I think I'm really interested in the sort of global contest between the US sports seeking new markets and growth, and the default world sport of soccer, and the contest between the two. But Mexico, because it's so close to the US, and kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, is almost like a semi-domestic market for a lot of American culture and products. So while the NFL might not have a huge global following, its following in Mexico is very much to the same level as its following within the United States. It is huge. Similar with the baseball leagues and the NBA. So the kind of glue in the relationship that came to sports really were the American sports for decades. And soccer was the way in which Mexico connected with the rest of the world, and the US was just not part of that game, right? When I came to the States when I was 15, it was shocking to me how I felt foreign only when it came to the fact that like Americans were not following the sport that I had grown up with. But that's changed because again, that was in the 1980s. And today you have a very different situation where Americans now are more, soccer is not the most followed sport at the professional level, but it is one of the sports that now, kids follow, they play, they all grew up playing FIFA, the video game, that hugely influential. And now in the US, I can watch the Premier League on NBC. I can watch, La Liga on ESPN. When I first came to the States, it was like good luck trying to watch a World Cup. So what's been interesting in terms of the Mexico-US relationship through sport is that soccer is now part of that bridging in a way that's been kind of fun to watch. A little bit scary for Mexican soccer fans because when I was a kid, the US never qualified for World Cups, and Mexico would always beat the US 5 or 6-0 or something. And suddenly it became a really even and heated rivalry. It's a very interesting, and now suddenly Canada has entered the fray, qualifying for their first World Cup in a long time, and they happen to have a really good team, and they beat Mexico, and so now it's a three-way contest. But the U.S.-Mexico rivalry in soccer is a more recent thing, and it's kind of interesting. And the relationship between the two leagues, I would also say, is an intriguing component here, because I think both the MLS and La Liga MX in Mexico feel like, there's been speculation about a potential merger. That might be too difficult and complicated, but there are things short of a merger, expanding kind of like some binational competition, cups, and there's a CONCACAF Cup, which is sort of like the equivalent of the Champions League in Europe. But I think between those two leagues, there's a lot more to be done. And I think it's attractive to both for different reasons. I mean, the most watched soccer games on the TV in the US continue to be Liga MX games. So those will get a higher viewership than MLS games, which is really interesting. And again, speaks to the weight of the Mexican American community in the US.
Can you expand a bit on that relationship between the MLS and the La Liga MX, MX, or I don't know how to pronounce that really, but can you expand a little bit, because there were talks of like doing a joint tournament. What do you see that heading actually?
It's constantly evolving, and I feel like every month you see new proposals for where this should head. You have seen an expansion in the competition that includes the top teams from both, where there used to be just, it all used to occur in the CONCACAF context. The CONCACAF is our region, which includes a lot of the Caribbean countries, Central America. But now there's more of an effort to have a competition just between the two leagues. I think Gianni Infantino from FIFA has actually said that FIFA believes that there would be some merit in the two leagues merging, which is interesting because, historically, FIFA is very much opposed to sort of this kind of cross-border, and there's some discussion between the Belgian and the Dutch league too, about some form of, it's really complicated because of the scale of the countries, also the ownership model of the MLS. It's kind of like one entity. Each club doesn't have its separate ownership. When you buy a franchise, in the MLS, you're kind of buying into the entire entity. So that's really kind of a complicated structure to merge with someone else. The economics are very different. I think it's interesting right now that the Liga MX it's a bigger league. There's more, it's funny. I've talked to people at European clubs about how they see the MLS and the Liga MX. The MLS currently is still like an exporting league. it's actually one of the things that's benefited the US national team, paradoxically, is the relative weakness of our domestic league. So what does that mean? It means that it's more likely that a very good American player will go play in Europe than it is for a very good Mexican player, because the Mexican league is still a bigger league that pays much higher salaries. So the Mexican league is less of an export league. It's more of a destination league. It's sort of in between the big European leagues and the Latin American leagues that tend to just export, right? So they're financially stronger. So if you look at clubs like Monterrey and Guadalajara and America, their payrolls might be 3x, 5x what an MLS team is, but obviously be considerably less than, a club like Monterrey might have a payroll that's similar to like Burnley in the English league, or maybe like a championship team, but far larger than would be the case for an MLS team. So they can recruit talent even from some European leagues or from South America, and make it very comfortable for a player to not go to Europe. Whereas more of the American players are going to Europe because the salaries in the MLS are much lower. So there's more of a natural relationship that can occur typically between an MLS club and a European club in terms of the hierarchy. The Mexican, it varies too by Mexican club. Now, the very, very top Mexican players are still going to be incentivized to go to Europe, right? But it's like, where is the bar of the point at which you're more likely to want to go to Europe? So that's just kind of an interesting economic observation. And yet the flip side of this is that the MLS teams, while they're spending less money and the level of play is lower than it is in Mexico, the teams are much more valuable. Like, just because it's kind of amazing how successful the MLS has been in pricing those franchises. Every time there's an expansion, the new owners have to pay more and more. I think it's up to like 400 million or something like that for the value of the team. Whereas in Mexico, those numbers would be far lower. And this is just a bet on the future of the MLS and like the competitiveness of US sports, leagues as a whole. So these things are interesting, but they're relevant in terms of thinking about if you were to merge and create one league. It's hard, just given the different ways in which ownership is structured and the valuations between a team in Toluca, Mexico versus Charlotte, North Carolina, and then also the governance in the Mexican league and in some of the clubs needs to be more, there needs to be more professionalization. There's a kind of weaker institutionalization. It very much varies by club, whereas the MLS is more uniform. So all of which is to say that while the idea of a full merger with like different, divisions or conferences on both sides of the border, it sounds really cool in the abstract, and it's something that I would get very excited about. It's probably too complicated to pull off anytime soon. And so I think right now there's all of this exploration of what can be done short of that. And then sharing a World Cup, which is kind of where you started, is hugely exciting too. And it's another way in which we can manifest the closeness of this relationship through sport. It's kind of interesting that was decided and announced against the backdrop of this the Trump politics, right? And I think that was an interesting statement that you can have one tone in the political relationship, but sport and culture can have this remedial play this remedial role of reminding people that, like, well, this relationship isn't necessarily dictated by whatever campaign rhetoric one politician wants to have. Because as you pointed out, Mexico, the United States, and probably Canada are all perfectly capable of pulling off a World Cup on their own. Like, there's an intentionality in positing this as a shared World Cup. that's trying to make this bigger statement.
So if I understood correctly, sort of to sum up, you have a relationship between Mexico and the US that's as close or similar, comparable to what we have in the European Union between countries like France, Italy, Germany, Spain, very close. Sort of different on some things for sure, but almost a broader relationship, really. And yet you have politics that are kind of trying to blame each other on things that happen. You mentioned that sports is a tremendous bridge and helped tremendously strengthen that relationship through football, but also through American football, basketball, and things like that. I have the intimate feeling that a World Cup is taking this 10 steps further. You know what I mean? Like hosting a World Cup together and including Canada into this, like the whole North American bloc, it's taking this 10 steps further into this relationship. So where personally do you see this going and transposing outside of sports? Maybe I'm thinking the quickest, the thing I'm thinking of is like a common currency or whatever, maybe, I don't know. Like, you know what I mean? Like kind of where, like how much is this going to strengthen the relationship that it's going to take it off the field? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I like how you put that, and that's often how I think about, you know, what is sport advancing beyond sport, right? And so I do think that the symbiotic relationship between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, but particularly between the U.S. and Mexico, you know, our two countries are as intertwined and codependent as you see between a lot of, you know, your Western European EU member states. One of the differences is that the reality has kind of outpaced the politics. Like there has not yet been a political acceptance or a social contract within each of the two countries and across both countries that this is the reality, like there has been in Europe. And even in Europe, this creates frictions and tensions, right? But the European Union, as you said, includes a freedom of labor movement. And when I say the reality has outpaced the politics, you know, any economist would tell you that you can't create one economy, one integrated economy for goods and services, but then pretend that labor is a completely different, you know, it should be in a completely different category. And that is what NAFTA did. NAFTA very much looks like all of the agreements that led up to today's European Union in terms of removing restrictions to the movement of goods and services and capital, but said, wait a minute, labor, no, we can't go there. And any serious economists will tell you like that's not going to work. And that's why you end up having a lot of unregulated movement of labor, because the economies, you have made them one economy, but you have pretended that that's not going to be the case for one aspect. So there's even more of a gap, I think, in our context, between the level of integration between our North American nations and the political, where the politics are. That gap is bigger than it would be in Europe, where there's more of a political acceptance of the reality. And even there, it's not perfect, and there's going to be some tensions, as we saw with Brexit, right? So the interesting question is, okay, what are some of the forces that can help close this gap? And I think sport and culture more broadly, you know, are kind of culinary ties, and like the ways in which Latin culture is embraced in the US and certainly vice versa, and then sport being a part of that. My hope is that over time that does help close this gap and this understanding that, you know, as we see more and more, you know, I had a conversation, we did a public event with the university recently with the Pittsburgh Steelers, talking about their following in Mexico, and the NFL now understanding that these international markets are so important, passed new regulations where the NFL teams can treat some foreign markets as an extension of their local market, where they could make, you know, commercial sponsorship deals and such. And the Pittsburgh Steelers, like a lot of the NFL teams, wanted Mexico to be on their list of the markets where they could do this. And you talk to people at the Pittsburgh Steelers, and they think that Mexico is almost like an extension of Western Pennsylvania in terms of their following. And you're going to start seeing. And so one of the big questions that the NFL and the NBA and the MLB have thought about is, they're already playing regular season games in Mexico, right? The same way that they take some games to Wembley. But the big question is, should we have an NFL team based in Mexico? And I think that's very possible. I mean, so I think it's possible that you could have American leagues having teams in Mexico, the way some of them already have teams in Canada, not the NFL, but MLS and MLB. And then maybe Liga MX would be allowed to have an affiliated team in the US. There was a short experiment of this with a team in LA a few years back. So I think we're going to see more of this. And I think the World Cup will be a moment where more of this experimentation will be encouraged and will happen as a result of the World Cup, where it's not just the one-off tournament, but how can we kind of mesh together our domestic competitions more to reflect how we really are one market in so many different ways. And I think sport is kind of one of the instruments where we can bring some rationality and close this gap between how we talk about this relationship sometimes in politics versus the lived experiences of people on a day-to-day basis and the economic reality.
All right, so I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. And it was a topic that both of us were very interested in. So thank you so much for joining us and talk to us about it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We can leave your Twitter. You use Twitter a lot?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna leave Andrés' Twitter in the description. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Game.Set.Deal for more content on sports and geopolitics and to stay updated on future episodes. I'll catch you in the next one.